Hello. I am here with Steve Kupfer, partner at Reach Capital and a longtime friend and supporter of mine, which I'm very grateful for. He was an early reader of the Edge newsletter, continues to read the Edge Sheet newsletter, and just all around great guy. I don't want to embarrass him too much by reading all his accomplishments, but I would, Steve, like you to talk a little bit about your career and how you ended up where you are today. I think one of the fun parts of, particularly for investors in the space, is they usually come from a lot of disparate paths, but investing feels like their home once they get there. So that's a educated guess on your career, but I'd rather hear it straight from you. How did you get here?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. We miss you on the East Coast, but we're happy to. So I kind of followed the breadcrumbs. I started earlier in my career deploying special ed technology in large urban school systems. So I lived out of a suitcase for 5 years. I was in schools, in central offices, 4 days a week for 12 to 18 months at a time, rolling out software that helped educators facilitate the referral, evaluation, IEP development process, and the Medicaid billing side. So I spent a couple years in New Orleans, a couple years in Miami, a year in Nashville, Minneapolis, and everywhere I went, I was fascinated by the fact that they all had strategic plans that looked strikingly similar, but were organized completely differently, funded differently, governed differently. Principal autonomy was all over the map. Obviously, state political dynamics that were very, very different. So I was really fascinated by just the socio-political complexity that drove the way that these districts were governed, even though they had, very different conditions, through which to do so. So to get closer to that problem, I took a job in an executive search firm to place superintendents and CEOs in those same big urban systems so I could get closer to boardrooms and, mayor's offices. And that was, fascinating kind of view behind the curtain of just how these big public organizations, which are often the largest employer of their communities, operate. And so did that for a couple of years. We did the search in Baltimore City. We did the search in Cleveland. And I was really surprised by how much of a gap there was between the folks that were deputies, assistant superintendents, and the skills it took to lead the district. All these things that you kind of became more of a politician, and you had to understand things like board governance and capital budgeting and facilities management, all these things you didn't learn coming through the system. So we spun out an organization to train those folks and give them kind of almost like an executive training. If you want to be a superintendent, here are the things you're probably not going to learn coming through the ranks that are really important for you keeping the job. And you can't do the job if you can't keep the job. So we trained several hundred folks. About 20% of them got halfway through the content and said, I don't think I want to be a superintendent anymore, which
No.
was kind of we thought a great
Good to get that answer early,
really
though,
good,
before
yeah.
you get the job.
Because
Yeah.
we were doing
Yeah.
search alongside this, and we were like, okay,
Yeah.
it's good that you figured it out now before you got the
Yeah.
job and realized you're in the political crosshairs all day. Are you comfortable with that? So it was kind of an interesting, filtering process. And so I became a clearinghouse for a lot of those folks who would get the job and then would call me and say, hey, I want to put together, a team. Here's some technology issues we have. We're going to have to close schools. Like, who can you connect me to that's gone through that process that appreciates the political complexity and the community trauma that goes with doing that? And so through all that, I kind of aggregated all these themes, these things that were consistent issues that I felt, in the spirit of building those relationships, I wanted to contribute. Obviously, I played a role in them getting to those roles. I wanted to be able to make sure they were successful. So when they would call me with those problems, I would call philanthropy, I would call investors, I would call other great districts, folks that I knew were really deep in talent networks. And that led me to great founders. And it was this really fascinating kind of in the morning being in the belly of these bureaucracies, and then in the afternoon talking to founders that, had the audacity to completely reimagine the way that we were doing certain things. It was
Relentless optimism. Yeah.
Yeah, it was this really fascinating kind of day-to-day difference in the conversations I was having. And so I had a couple of founders that just said, you just kind of natively understand this. Are you interested in advising or investing? And at that point, I had gotten my MBA while I was working full time out of my suitcase because I figured, what else am I going to do? The company sponsored me for it.
Heaven forbid you should have a life.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Like, I'm on the road, might as well continue learning while I'm at it. And so outside of that, and I didn't have much familiarity with the investing ecosystem, but I knew I wanted to support these founders, and I felt like I was in kind of a unique position at the crossroads, so to speak, to be able to facilitate really productive discussions with various domain experts that, I would be able to say to a superintendent, talk to this person about the bilingual speech pathology shortage because they think about this all day long, and in many cases, vice versa. So that led me to do some personal investing. To my wife's chagrin, putting some of our savings into some of these businesses because I like felt I could support them and had kind of unbridled optimism because I hadn't been an investor before. I didn't know any better than that this was
Yeah.
a good decision or a bad decision. I just felt like I could de-risk them a lot. I wanted to work with those founders in a more formal way. And it was an opportunity again for me to learn. So started doing that. I syndicated, 20, 30 deals, joined a few boards, built a bunch of relationships, joined the Vistry Group as an operating partner to kind of help build their K-12 themes and support their K-12 businesses at the very inception of that firm in 2013. And then kind of felt this itch to get back into the early stage. Vistry had gotten really large, have almost 11 billion under management at this point. And Jennifer at Reach called and said, hey, like, we're thinking about another fund. Would this be interesting to talk about? And here I am. We're 2.5 years later and really excited to be kind of full-time in the venture side again.
I will embarrass you a little bit. Your list of companies that you've been involved with, and I think it's not even the full list on your LinkedIn page is I think worth the visit for anyone who is watching this. There's a million different ways we could go with this. I think what I would love to spend some time on is the special ed portion of your career. And I think what's interesting to me about it is special ed, I think, has been sort of the precursor to what has become, and you can tell me this is a bad bridge, but to today's ESAs and the concept that a school would work with outside partners in order to facilitate the needs of a student. And that's happened in a lot of different ways over the past, call it 20, 30 years. And it goes back even a little bit further than that. But I think like these past 20, 30 years has been sort of the formalization of that part of the sector and an understanding that like there's a lot of different ways to meet kids' needs. And special ed started with, just send them to a dedicated school. I think now, maybe this is wrong, but I think a lot of the pendulum has swung back towards let's figure out how to serve them in-house through a variety of both people and technology. And I think I would be curious if that experience feels useful as you start to predict the future of the ESA and sort of what I'm calling the student funded universe of K-12 schooling rather than the school funded universe of K-12 schooling.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, Matt. I think if nothing else, it really sheds light on the resource burden that schools face because they are required by federal law to provide free and public education. So if a parent requests an evaluation, that's not a choice that they can make at the school level. They have to provide that evaluation. So, that puts kind of, a level of unbridled resource burden onto a district, particularly coming out of the pandemic, as parents have learned more about the evaluation process and they kind of saw behind the curtain in a lot of these remote environments, how far behind their kids were in some places. We saw a pretty huge boom in evaluations. And when you have fixed budgets on an annual basis, and many of those regulated funding sources can't get rolled over into subsequent years, if you're a district, your hands are kind of tied. If you get asked to give 30% more evaluations than you budgeted for, you have to start to find better labor models to deliver those services. Otherwise, you have to either thread the line of legal compliance, or you have to start to kind of artificially constrain through the way you communicate with parents, or don't in most cases, to kind of minimize the resource burden in order to deliver those. Special ed has always been kind of on the forefront of advocacy in public ed. And I think it's been one of the reasons that a lot of parents have become, some evangelists when it comes to their local public school, because the special ed process is as hard for them to go through as it is for the district to deliver. So I think there's a lot to be said for that concept being applied on the ESA side. Well, not just for special ed, but what if I want them to learn in a different language? What if I want them, there's so many different scenarios that we can't possibly ask the school system to provide all of these simultaneously. It's not in line with the budgetary realities.
Yeah, well, I think that's what's so hard about this, right? And what I appreciated about the article that you wrote, which we'll link to, was so much of the conversation around ESAs is on like parent freedom and individual choice and et cetera, which is relevant. I get why that's appealing. But the perspective you had, which to me is still pretty novel, I haven't seen much written about it yet, is the making sure that we are cognizant of what's happening to the schools and the need for the schools to evolve beyond just like, mediums of instruction to resource managers and thinking about, the school of the future might just be a complex, system of resource allocation that includes, a traditional classroom, but also includes a micro school. And you wrote about like, district soccer, right? And like if you start to say like the school is the sort of center of the community that helps make sure resources are allocated across all of the students in the district as sort of equitably as is possible. I think that's a super like it's a real vision for the future rather than just like a, bet on parent freedom, parent choice. So I don't know if there's anything in there that you'd want to go deeper on of like how this stuff might work, but to me it was a breath of fresh air to read about the school perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think we have to work within the practical constraints that we operate through. So, something that a couple conversations I've had recently, notion that you can have a big consulting shop come into these districts, which many of them have, and have just said, consolidate, right size, close 8 schools, merge them into, these 15 buildings. That way you can consolidate your staff. You're not looking at building maintenance anymore. And the practical reality is that is not a politically viable option. And we saw in Denver last week, they put a 5-year moratorium on school
Well, and
closures.
just super quickly, I'm putting out an ed sheet like right after we talk, and one of the articles is the Chicago public school system, which has had a moratorium on school closure since 2013,
Yeah.
and now has schools that are at 10% capacity,
Yeah.
just giant empty schools.
So it's really easy, right? From like the spreadsheet warrior's perspective to say, okay, well, this here's how we optimize this. And I think the reality is like these are living, breathing communities where these schools are sacred cows. And it's not as easy. Many superintendents over the years that have said, like, good luck going to that community and closing a Frederick Douglass High School. Like it's the heart of that community, whether it's fully utilized by the math or not. I think our state and local policymakers have to make a determination of what do we fund and what is the spirit of community-based public education. If that is predicated on optimal utilization of our students, we're not changing the sizes of libraries when populations go up and down. There are certain public services that aren't necessarily subject to that same kind of utilization requirement. And so not only from a political reality, the financial reality, they would love to believe that we could right size a lot of the fixed costs when in reality it makes a very small dent. And I think that's the logic around a lot of the CPS, that at face value, your casual reader looks at that and said, this is insane. Like what great evidence of government waste, I think, is probably the first thing that comes to mind, instead of really thinking back from first principles as to, okay, well, what does the school represent? Is there a better way to deliver these services? Is there a better way to utilize the footprint of this building? I think is a very logical next question. Does that mean that we're going to make up the difference between a fully enrolled revenue base at that school or one that's 10% of them? Of course not. But that, again, comes back to what are our community values? Our values is around the role of public education in these buildings. And if we're trying to run them with perfect utilization math, and maybe some communities will want that, and they'll be willing to close these schools in order to accommodate a rezoning that we know is going to benefit certain people much more than others. And so I think that is, we've been so accustomed to looking at it as a zero sum, like either we have these fully utilized public schools or we embrace kind of this entirely new vision of choice that is separate from that. What's disappointing to me is that I think districts aren't great storytellers. And so you see a lot of great things happening sometimes that they don't tell those stories. And in this context, I think there are a ton of assets that they bring to bear to the community that they don't think twice about because it's native to them. But for a choice family who, boy, like there are some things I would really like to be able to provide for my child academically, but the school also offers a lot of assets, including infrastructure and specialized buildings that you can't possibly build in a similar linear way on the choice side, that I wish they would be better about recognizing.
Yeah. And, again, I think COVID for some, and for me particularly, it highlighted how much of school was not about instruction. And even having my own kid, right? It's like, it is a form of daycare, as sort of uncomfortable as that can be. But I think what I wrestle with the most is like, how do we make the leap from, again, a environment today where the sort of standard operating procedure is where schools are funded on a like per school basis directionally. I know there's nuance underneath here,
Mhm.
to a place where public school is funded on a per school basis to one where it's funded on a per student basis. I think like, I believe that the future scenario is sort of a student-led, student like individualized funding stream, but I don't know how to get there without like a ton of damage. Like today when a family leaves a public school with ESA funding, it's like that funding gets taken directly from a school. And I think you had a good example in the article of where this is becoming less the case and where they're sort of experimenting around the fringes. I don't know if you have yet, like you can talk about the Utah example or just help us visualize that path where we end up on the other side with a healthy, functioning public system.
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, like the foundational requirement for this to be viable is political will. Like
Yeah.
historically, the unions have been extremely powerful voices, and I don't, I'm pro great school, and if that's that may come across as like an easy out, but like I can kind of take or leave the unions. Like I think unions have a very important role to play in many cases. I think sometimes they misjudge the political landscape and take positions that are not in their best interest. I think I can believe both of those things to be true in a climate where it's not popular to acknowledge that. And so I think there has to be political will and there has to be an appreciation for the fact that this is not necessarily cost neutral. Like we have to find a way to better fund public schools. I do not believe coming out of the pandemic that there is a political will to add more funding to the current model. And so I think it's going to take a politician to capitalize on some of the evidence that we have and be in a position to say we need more money for public education, but we're going to do it in a different way that puts a little bit more control in the power of hands without putting districts on the hook for the fixed costs that they cannot control. Like if you lose 15 students, the revenue that goes away with that, you can't pay fractional heat bills. You can't, there's a bunch of things that are fixed in that equation that you can't move around. So the job of the legislators are going to have to square that equation and say, we're going to have to be willing to pay a little bit more. And that's going to require political will, because then you got to go out, for tax bonds. You got to sell this, whether it's either in election cycles or through bonds, that like, this is what our plan is from a capital perspective. And if you don't have the votes to do it, that's going to be really hard. So there's no path. I guess I say all that to say, like, there's no path where we can seamlessly use the existing policies and funding mechanisms and just find a way to make this work. And so I've tried to be honest about the fact that maybe that political will doesn't exist, or maybe it exists only in pockets, and that this like legacy,
or after a black swan event,
or after a black swan event. Like I think that's what makes this moment in time kind of unique, because we're seeing evidence with a lot of this technology that this consumer-facing stack is going to exist. There's no question about that. And there's no question that the ESAs in pockets will be very successful and other pockets will struggle with implementation and fall on their faces and have to go through a significant re-engineering to be successful. But the one thing that I'm very confident in this equation, there's not a whole lot of certainty, but the one thing that is certain, the consumer stack is going to get cheaper, better, higher quality, more accessible to the broad population. So that obviously plays into the hand of the family choice in the ESA market. The degree to which politicians and voters decide that we're going to adjust the role of public education in the buildings to recognize that or not is kind of the big question. But I think the pathway is capitalizing on a lot of the examples that we've seen with the appreciation for the political will and the funding mechanisms that have to exist.
I think you framed that really well. I think it's sort of like, you can bet on the portion of the market that is sort of the expansion of what we traditionally called the homeschool market, which is, billions of kids. And it stands to reason that you, especially if the public school system's struggling, would see an expansion of that demographic on its own. I think it's a fair question to ask, like, look, there is a way to structure this from a policy perspective on a very local level to be able to keep those kids sort of within the broader orbit, even if they're not in, the like traditional classroom. So I think that's framed really well. And I think it also speaks to, and this is a place where you've been doing this for a long time, and I think understand this as well as anyone, like the like business of education is sort of fundamentally political. And that's not like a good or a bad thing, but it is a thing. And it's sort of like part of, understanding who to invest in on the private side, and then how things are going to function on the public side is understanding the political capital people are willing to put into education initiatives. So yeah, I just appreciate like, there are some questions that come down to political will, and it's not just like, can some, heroic individual or private company change the narrative? It's like, no, this is a community question.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was really interesting to see Shapiro in Pennsylvania like get really close to thinking like, I think this might be a politically viable path to open ESAs up in Pennsylvania, like which would have been a pretty formidable moment for the ESA movement. Didn't quite get there. Like, and I think it's just a matter of time as we see the consumer stack get further along. And as to your point, I think there's a non-trivial percentage of parents out there that the idea of homeschooling and like that control is compelling, agnostic to childcare piece. Like, okay, so what if I could just do that like a couple afternoons a week? Or what if there's a way for me just to kind of better address the childcare, the fact that I need to work and that working families are going to have two parents that work or a single parent that works? That has to be addressed here. My hope is that as that consumer stack becomes more rich, as the supply side of that ESA marketplace becomes more compelling and you see pockets of success, it will push those districts to further recognize like we have to use the assets that we have, and we have a lot that the choice movement on its own cannot offer. And so my hope is that those two realizations are politically convenient for lawmakers to drive laws that both recognize the value that these buildings play as community heartbeats and recognize kind of a new dawn of parents expecting some more control over the experience that they have with their children.
Yeah. I think Texas is a great example too of like USA's failed at least once, maybe a couple of times before finally passing this year. So it's calculus. One last question, and then I'll let you get on with your Friday afternoon. You talked about sort of parent preference and sort of the consumer stack being available to parents. I think one of the things that feels sort of overwhelming to me, even as a person who like spends a lot of time thinking about education and like the companies that operate within education, is like, how do I manage my stack? Like how do I equip myself properly and make sure I'm making the right decisions? Like before, I almost like, because the school is doing it, I didn't have to think about it. So even if they were doing it poorly, it just wasn't in my like brain that like this was an option. And now I feel like I have this, to some it might be super exciting. I think to most it probably feels like a burden. Like what are there any sort of switches that you think will get flipped there? Is that just like, that's just sort of the hard work of being a parent? What are your thoughts in this area?
I think this is what's great about working in the earliest stages of venture. In our portfolio between Pathfinder and KaiPod, two examples of companies that are making it easier on both the supply side, with KaiPod getting teachers who also want more flexibility. I think it's another part of this equation that just makes the timeliness of it interesting. Teachers
Yeah.
went into schools 5 days a week at a time when everybody else was sitting at home working in their pajamas for 2 days a week. And I think there was a recognition of like, hey, boy, it'd be really nice to have some
Yeah.
flexibility here. Are there like, I think teachers would
And
embrace
ownership, like
yes,
ownership of what they're doing.
ownership
Even
and
like the flexibility too, but ownership.
Absolutely. We hear over and over, like it's one of the hardest jobs imaginable. And so KaiPod, like unlocking the ability for teachers to deal with all of the operational lift of getting a micro school off the ground from a regulatory perspective, from an insurance perspective, from a accounting perspective, from a content building perspective, all of like the stack you require on the teacher side, that is a great, business that's emblematic of that kind of support. And then on the supply side, Pathfinder helping cultivate like what that learning constellation might look like. And so I think like what I tried to describe in my piece is like there's an operational layer. And I guess going back to the utilization piece, like it's fascinating to me to see a lot of these schools that are 70, 80% utilized that still say finding places to deliver special ed services or do IEP meetings. Like it's really hard to find the space to do that. It's like, but you have a lot of open space. It's really, really hard. Obviously, like it's a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, it's the former woodworking shop.
Yeah. The school schedule in and of itself is like a tremendous exercise in logistics and orchestrating a building on a day-to-day basis. So Pathfinder is kind of taking that content side, but we need that operational layer that helps connect the schools and the infrastructure footprint that they have to those kinds of solutions. And I think like once those start to get built and we see a lot of positive examples of that being deployed, that will start to kind of cultivate that political will. Like we need to be able to a point, to situations where this is working really, really effectively. And once we have enough test beds, like I think we'll see that experimentation continue. And then as that consumer side accelerates, as these tools just make it more like a consumer experience to build that instead of having to just dig through the web or ask ChatGPT, like, what is the best stack for a kid with this profile? I think that's the kind of accelerant that we need to get to the political place where we can legislate it into some more scale.
Yeah. Well, again, I really earnestly appreciated the perspective of the piece. As much as I understand and often empathize with the sort of parent choice and wanting to be able to like, I talk about like education as public good, but it's consumed in a highly individualized way, no matter where you go. So I get the parent choice side and why that has resonated so strongly post COVID. I also believe really strongly in public education and want there to be, like you said, a locus of community in every town. I really liked that you were trying to air that perspective just as much as the other perspective, which tends to get more airtime. So thank you. That's a very long-winded thank you.
Thanks, Jack.
And I encourage everyone to read it, and that we'll have another article to talk about sometime soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome.